The letter was sitting on my kitchen table when I got home, tucked underneath a flyer for a pizza place I'd never ordered from. I almost missed it. I almost wish I had. It was from my landlord's property management company. A formal notice printed on thick cream paper, the kind that costs more to produce than it should, like they wanted you to feel the weight of what they were saying before you even read a word. I stood there in my coat, still wet from the sleet outside, and read it twice because the first time didn't feel real. 60 days. That was what I had left. 60 days to either pay the full amount of back rent I owed, 4 months of it, or vacate the unit. In Winnipeg, Manitoba, in the middle of February, 60 days sounds like a lot until you do the math and realize you have exactly $0 in your checking account and no idea where it's going to come from. My name is Owen Sinclair. I was 29 years old, and until about 7 months before that letter arrived, I had what most people would consider a fairly decent life. Not flashy, not exceptional, but solid. I worked as a junior estimator for a mid-sized construction firm in the north end of Winnipeg. Good hours, honest pay, extended health benefits. I had a one-bedroom apartment on Selkirk Avenue that I'd rented for almost 4 years, long enough that I knew which floorboard squeaked and which burner on the stove ran too hot. I had a cat named Biscuit who hated everyone except me, and a slowly growing collection of second-hand hockey books I kept meaning to actually read. Nothing remarkable, but it was mine, and I was proud of it in the quiet way that people are proud of things they built slowly, over time, without any help. Then the firm lost a major contract, a school renovation project that had been in the pipeline for 2 years, and within 3 weeks, they let go of 6 people. I was the last hired on the estimating team, which meant I was the first to go. My supervisor, a guy named Pete who I genuinely liked, looked physically ill when he told me. He kept saying it wasn't about performance, and I believed him, which almost made it worse. I packed my desk into a cardboard box and took the bus home in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, watching the city go by through a fogged-up window, trying to process the fact that everything had just changed while the rest of Winnipeg carried on completely unbothered. I filed for EI the next morning and got to work applying for jobs. That part I felt okay about at first. Construction estimating is a specific skill, but there's demand for it, and I had 4 years of solid experience. I figured a month, maybe 2 at the outside. I kept a spreadsheet of every application I sent. I color-coded the follow-ups. I was organized, methodical, almost cheerful about it in the early weeks because I genuinely believed it was just a matter of time. But months went by. The EI helped, but it didn't come close to covering rent plus groceries, plus the hydro bill, plus everything else that quietly adds up when you're actually paying attention to it. I started making choices that felt reasonable at the time. Skipping a month's payment here, negotiating with Manitoba Hydro there, telling myself I'd catch up once I had income again. What I didn't fully understand yet was how fast those deferred payments stack up. How quickly a small gap becomes a wall. By the time that cream-colored letter landed on my kitchen table, I owed my landlord's company 4 months of back rent. I had $93 in my account. A job interview lined up for the following week that I was trying not to get my hopes up about, and a cat who needed a vet appointment I'd been putting off for 2 months. If you've ever been in a situation where you could see exactly how bad things were going to get and felt completely powerless to stop them, you know what the next few weeks felt like. I kept applying for work. I kept showing up to interviews, saying the right things, shaking the right hands. I contacted the rent assist program through the province, but the wait list was long and there was no guarantee I'd qualify in time. A friend from my old job lent me $500 without my even asking, just dropped it in my account one afternoon with a text that just said, "Pay me back whenever." I used it on groceries and partial hydro, because the power getting cut in February in Winnipeg isn't a minor inconvenience, it's a health emergency. 60 days started to feel very short very fast. Around day 45, I stopped pretending I wasn't scared and was making backup plans that I didn't want to make. I looked into whether my cousin in Brandon would let me stay with her family for a while. I looked at storage unit costs for my furniture. I started keeping Biscuit's carrier out on the floor because I knew she'd need time to get used to it, and I didn't want to add that stress to everything else at the last minute. Practical thinking, I told myself, not giving up, just being realistic. I want to stop here for a second and say something about shame because it was there the whole time and I don't think people talk about it enough. The actual fear of losing my home was bad, but the shame of it was something else entirely. I didn't tell my parents. I told them work was slow, that I was between jobs, that things were fine. I didn't tell most of my friends beyond the one who'd already figured it out. When I ran into my neighbor in the hallway, a retired teacher named Marion who always had a kind word and a bag of homemade raisin bread, I smiled and said things were going well. The lying felt awful, but the truth felt worse. There's a particular kind of loneliness in struggling financially as an adult, especially when you've always managed on your own. You feel like you've failed at something fundamental, like you've been found out. It was on day 51 that Beverly Ashton knocked on my door. I had seen Beverly Ashton exactly twice in 4 years. Once in the lobby when I was moving in, and once in the parking lot during a heat wave the summer before. She owned the building, not through a management company, but directly, personally. She'd bought it decades ago with her late husband and had kept it ever since. She was in her early 70s, slight, with white hair cut short and practical, and she had the kind of posture that made you stand up slightly straighter without meaning to. She lived in a house in Charleswood, on the other side of the city, and generally let the management company handle day-to-day operations. I had assumed this notice had come from her. I assumed she was here to follow up on it. I opened the door and felt my stomach drop. She was wearing a good coat, sensible boots, carrying a thermos and a small canvas bag. She looked at me with the kind of direct, unhurried attention that made me feel immediately transparent. "Owen," she said, not unkindly. "Do you have a few minutes?" We sat at my kitchen table. She set her thermos down and didn't open it. I offered her coffee and she said no thank you. For a moment neither of us said anything. Biscuit appeared from the bedroom, looked at her with intense suspicion, and then sat down just inside the doorway as if she were supervising. Beverly told me she'd come across my file when reviewing some paperwork from the management company, and that she'd asked for more context before anything moved forward with the eviction process. She spoke carefully, in the ways of someone who has learned the value of choosing words precisely. She said she'd seen difficult situations before, people who'd gone through layoffs, separations, medical crises, and that she'd made a habit over the years of not letting paperwork tell the whole story. Then she asked me what had happened. I don't know exactly why I told her everything. Maybe because she asked without any edge in her voice. Maybe because I was tired of pretending. Maybe because sitting across from someone who was looking at me like I was a person rather than an overdue account felt like something I hadn't experienced in a while. I told her about the firm losing the contract, about the layoff, about the EI running its course, about the applications and the interviews and the spreadsheet. I still kept updated out of something between discipline and denial. I told her about my friend's 500 sisses and how guilty I still felt about it. I told her about the storage unit research. I told her about my cousin in Brandon. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. She looked at her thermos. Then she said she wasn't there to rush the eviction. She said she'd been thinking about something for a while now. Something she'd been meaning to get started on for 2 or 3 years, but hadn't quite found the right moment or the right person to help her with it. She said the property she owned wasn't just this building. She had a small commercial space in the Exchange District that had been sitting mostly empty, used occasionally for storage, but that she'd always thought had potential for something more purposeful. She told me that for most of her working life before real estate, she'd been involved in workforce development. She'd run programs through the province in the 90s and early 2000s, initiatives focused on helping people retrain and re-enter the workforce after layoffs or career disruptions. She'd watched entire industries collapse in Manitoba over the decades and had spent years helping the people caught in those collapses figure out what to do next. Then she and her husband had shifted into real estate, and that chapter had closed. But she'd never stopped thinking about it, what she wanted to do, what she'd been sketching out in notebooks for longer than she wanted to admit, was open a small community resource space in the Exchange District, somewhere people could come for career support, skills workshops, one-on-one guidance on things like resume writing, interview prep, navigating EI, understanding apprenticeship programs. There were bigger organizations doing similar work across the city, she said, but she'd always believed there was value in something smaller, more personal, more neighborhood level. She just hadn't had the time or the right set of hands in to get it off the ground. She looked at me and said she wanted to offer me a deal. She would pause the eviction process and hold my back rent as a deferred balance, no interest, no penalties, for 4 months. In exchange, during those 4 months, she wanted me to work with her directly to get the community space operational. Not as charity, as a real working arrangement. She would pay me a modest stipend on top of the deferred rent, enough to cover my basics while we built it. And if things went the way she hoped, there might be something more permanent on the other side of it. I sat there and looked at her across the kitchen table and had absolutely no idea what to say. The honest answer was that I was overwhelmed. The relief of hearing, "I'm not pushing the eviction forward," hit me so suddenly that I had to breathe through it for a second before I could process anything else she'd said. But past the relief, something else was creeping in. This uncomfortable awareness that she was offering me something real, something that required me to actually show up and be useful. And I wasn't sure I had anything left in me to give. I'd been running on empty for months. I'd been grinding away at job applications and being optimistic for interviews and holding things together by myself for so long that I'd started to feel hollowed out, and yet, she wasn't offering me a handout. She was offering me work. Actual work with a purpose I could understand, connected to something I'd been living through myself for months. I told her yes. She nodded once, like that was the answer she'd expected. Then she opened her thermos, finally, and poured herself a cup of tea. She told me we'd start the following Monday. She told me to bring my laptop and whatever questions I had. She stood up, called Biscuit a practical-looking cat, and left. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after she went. The Monday after that conversation felt different from any Monday I'd had in a year. I took the bus to the Exchange District, walked through streets still gray with late winter, and found the commercial space on Bannatyne Avenue. A storefront unit, maybe 900 square feet, with big front windows looking out at the street, a back room that smelled like cardboard boxes, and a small bathroom in the corner that needed work. It was not impressive, but it had good bones, and the windows were genuinely beautiful, tall and old, the kind that flood a room with light when the sun cooperates. Beverly was already there when I arrived, wearing work clothes instead of the good coat, rolling up a window blind that had seen better decades. She handed me a legal pad with a list of tasks, and said we had a lot to figure out. We started from nothing, essentially. Beverly handled the structural and financial pieces, the licensing, the insurance, the relationship with the building, and pulled in favors from people she'd worked with over the years. My job, initially, was logistics and outreach. I researched what similar organizations were doing in Winnipeg and across the country. I contacted local employers about partnerships. I put together a simple intake process for people who'd come looking for help. I drafted content for a basic website. I sourced donated furniture, 3 filing cabinets from a closing dental office, a dozen mismatched chairs from a church that was renovating, a pair of long folding tables that a printing company was throwing out. That printing company came with a bonus I didn't anticipate. When I went to pick up the tables, I got talking with the woman coordinating the donation, a sharp, efficient person named Louise Gagnon, who managed operations for the company and who, it turned out, had been watching what we were doing in the Exchange District because a friend of hers had already heard about it through Beverly's network. Louise listened to me, explain what we were building, and started asking questions I hadn't expected. Detailed questions, operational questions, the kind that come from someone who has actually set up systems before and knows what breaks down. She asked me about my background. I told her about the construction estimating work, about the layoff, about how I'd ended up at the table with Beverly. She was quiet for a moment. Then she told me their company was in the middle of a slow expansion, new contracts, new territory, more administrative complexity than their current team could handle. They'd been looking for someone with an estimating and project coordination background for 3 months and hadn't found the right fit yet. She asked if she could set up a proper conversation with the firm's director. I said yes before I fully processed the question. 2 weeks later, 4 months almost to the day from when Beverly had sat at my kitchen table, I walked out of a meeting room in a low-rise office building on Notre Dame Avenue with a job offer in my hand. Permanent, full-time, benefits through Manitoba Blue Cross, salary that would let me not only pay back my rent but actually start building savings again. I sat in my car in the parking lot for a while. The offer letter was printed on thin white paper, nothing like that thick cream-colored eviction notice, and it was the lightest piece of paper I'd ever held. I went back to the Bannatyne space that afternoon and told Beverly. She looked at me for a second and then smiled in this quiet, unsurprised way that I'd started to recognize as her version of genuine happiness. She said, "Good. Now you don't have to go anywhere. I kept volunteering at the space on weekends, even after I started the new job, partly because I felt a real debt to what Beverly had built, and partly because walking through those doors every Saturday and seeing people sitting at those donated tables, people trying to figure out what came next, people who looked exactly like I had looked 7 months earlier, did something for me that I couldn't fully explain. It made the hardest part of the past year feel like something other than a waste. Like it had been preparation. Before this story ends, I want to ask you to do something. Leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from, and share one moment when someone gave you a second chance, or when you gave one to someone else. I believe those stories matter. I believe they remind us that the kind of generosity Beverly Ashton showed me isn't rare. It's just quiet. And it doesn't always make the news. The Bannatyne Community Resource Space, that's what we ended up calling it, has now been operating for 2 years. In that time, it's connected more than 300 people with employment support, skills training referrals, and one-on-one career guidance. It's small by any organizational measure, but for the people who've walked through those old windowed doors on a February afternoon with nothing but a problem they didn't know how to solve, for those people it's enormous. The thing I come back to most, when I think about all of it, is this. Beverly Ashton didn't see a problem tenant. She didn't see a liability. She saw a person who had fallen into a gap that the system wasn't designed to catch, and she made a choice. A very deliberate, very personal choice, to opt for something other than what the paperwork required. She didn't save me with money. She saved me with a reason to get up on a Monday morning. If you've been in that gap, if you've been reading eviction notices or lying awake, calculating what you can afford to skip this month, or smiling at your neighbors and saying things are fine when they really aren't, I want you to stow something. It changes. Not always the way you plan for. Not always on your timeline. But sometimes, late on a weekday afternoon, someone knocks on your door with a thermos of tea and a different question than the one you were bracing for, and everything quietly shifts. If this story stayed with you, please like it, share it with someone who might need to hear it today, and subscribe to Honor Stories for more. We'll be here every week with another one.